Kira's heart pounded in her chest as she ran through the dense alien jungle. The air was thick with humidity, and her legs burned from the effort of pushing through the unfamiliar terrain. Vines and branches snagged at her clothing, and every step seemed to sink her deeper into the spongy, moss-covered ground. The towering, bioluminescent trees glowed faintly in the dim light of the orange-hued sky, casting long, eerie shadows that made the landscape feel both alien and hostile. Her ship, the Starlight Horizon, was a smoking wreck somewhere behind her, deep in the heart of this untamed wilderness. The crash had been sudden and violent, the result of a catastrophic storm that had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, she and her crew were mapping the surface of Zelos-4, and the next they were plummeting through the atmosphere, fighting to regain control. She had barely managed to crawl out of the wreckage alive, but she was alone. Where the rest of her crew had gone, Kira didn't know. There had been no time to search for them, no time to do anything except run. The storm had passed, but the dangers of the planet were all too real. The distant cries of strange creatures echoed through the jungle, and Kira had already glimpsed the shifting forms of something large moving between the trees. She knew she couldn't stay in one place for long. Her lungs burned as she stumbled to a halt near a cluster of large rocks, using them as cover while she caught her breath. Sweat dripped down her face, and her hands trembled as she leaned against the stone. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. She had no way to contact her crew, no way to call for help. The atmosphere of Zelos-4 was playing havoc with her ship's communication systems, and now, her equipment was nothing but a pile of twisted metal. "Think, Kira," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. "You've trained for this. You can survive." But the words felt hollow. She had trained for emergencies. Yes, but nothing like this. Nothing had prepared her for being stranded alone on an alien planet, with no backup, no resources, and no idea if anyone else had survived. Her eyes scanned the jungle, searching for any sign of movement. But everything was still, too still. The oppressive silence made her uneasy, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a sharp noise, a rustling from behind, made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. She reached for the small utility knife at her belt, the only weapon she had left, and held it in front of her, her knuckles white with tension. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely steady. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the shadows of the jungle, a figure stepped forward, a tall man in what looked like a modified survival suit, his face obscured by a helmet. He moved with purpose, his posture calm and assured. But Kira didn't lower her guard. She didn't know if he was friend or foe. The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said, his voice muffled slightly by the helmet's visor. "I'm not here to hurt you." Kira narrowed her eyes, still clutching the knife. "Who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment, then reached up to remove his helmet. When he did, Kira was surprised to see a rugged, human face staring back at her. His brown hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his green eyes held a mixture of caution and sympathy. "My name's Jack," he said, his voice now clearer. "I crashed here a few months ago. I've been surviving in the jungle ever since." Kira's mind raced, trying to process the information. Another human, on this remote planet? She had thought her crew was the only team sent to explore Zelos-4. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice still wary. Jack nodded toward the direction she had come from. "Saw the smoke from your crash. I've been scouting the area for supplies and spotted you running. Figured you could use some help." Kira's grip on the knife loosened slightly, but she didn't put it away. "I'm Kira. My ship went down in the storm. I don't know where the rest of my crew is, or if they're even alive." Jack's expression softened, and he took a step closer, his movement slow and non-threatening. "I'm sorry to hear that. This planet isn't kind to survivors. I haven't found any others from your crash yet, but I know this area well. I can help you if you'll let me." Kira studied him for a moment, weighing her options. She didn't trust easily, and the situation was far too precarious to let her guard down completely, but Jack didn't seem like a threat. If anything, he looked just as worn and tired as she felt, and the truth was, she needed help. She couldn't survive alone on this planet, not with the dangers that lurked in every shadow. Finally, she nodded, lowering the knife but keeping it close. All right. But if you try anything, Jack raised his hands again, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. You won't have to worry about that. I'm just here to survive, same as you. Together, they began to make their way through the jungle, the thick underbrush crunching under their feet as they moved deeper into the alien wilderness. Jack led the way, his movements sure and practiced, while Kira followed, still wary, but feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since the crash. You've been here for months? Kira asked as they walked, glancing over at him. Jack nodded. Yeah. My ship went down in a storm. Same as yours. The planet's atmosphere makes it nearly impossible to send a distress signal. I've been trying to figure out a way off ever since. Kira's heart sank. If Jack hadn't found a way off after all this time, what chance did she have? But she pushed the thought aside. There had to be a way. She couldn't give up yet. We'll find a way out, Kira said, her voice more confident than she felt. We have to. Jack glanced back at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I like the optimism. As they pressed on, Kira couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in Jack's presence. She didn't know him, and yet there was something about him that made her feel less alone. Maybe it was the shared struggle, the knowledge that they were both fighting to survive on this unforgiving planet. Or maybe it was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. But one thing was certain. In a world as dangerous as Zalos 4, having an ally, having Jack, was her only hope. The dense, alien jungle seemed to close in around Kira and Jack as they trekked deeper into the wilderness. The bioluminescent plants that lined the path glowed softly, casting a strange, otherworldly light over the foliage. Every rustle in the trees or distant animal cry made Kira tense, her nerves on edge. The knowledge that she was stranded on a hostile, unfamiliar planet only deepened her anxiety. But with Jack leading the way, there was a small sense of relief. He knew this place better than she did, and for now, she had to trust him. How much farther? Kira asked, keeping her voice low as she carefully stepped over a tangle of roots. Not far, Jack replied, glancing back at her. We'll reach my shelter soon. I've been working on it since I got here. It's hidden, but it's safe. Safe. The word sounded like a luxury. Kira had been running on adrenaline since the crash, unsure of when the next threat would appear. The creatures on this planet, though unseen so far, sounded large and aggressive, judging by the distant roars that echoed through the jungle. And then there was the storm, the one that had taken down both of their ships, which could return at any moment. As they walked, Kira studied Jack. He moved with purpose, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs of danger. His survival skills were impressive. He had clearly been through a lot to make it this far alone. She couldn't imagine being stranded here for months, with no hope of rescue and no one to rely on. He seemed calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a kind of resolve that only came from enduring something difficult. How did you survive all this time? Kira asked after a long pause, her curiosity getting the better of her. This planet's not exactly welcoming. Jack chuckled softly. It's not. But I've had plenty of time to figure out how to stay alive. The first few weeks were rough. I scavenged what I could from my ship. But after that, it was all about learning the land. The creatures here are dangerous, but they have patterns. And the storms? They're unpredictable, but if you find the right shelter, you can make it through. Kira nodded, though she still couldn't fathom what it must have been like to be completely alone for so long. And no one else? No sign of other survivors? Jack shook his head. Not from my crew. I've explored a lot of this area, but I haven't found anyone else. The thought made Kira's heart sink. She had hoped that some of her crewmates might have made it out of the crash alive, but the chances seemed slim now. Still, she clung to the small hope that they might be out there, somewhere, waiting for help. She wasn't ready to give up on them yet. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached a small clearing in the jungle, hidden behind a wall of thick vines and towering trees. Jack pushed the vines aside, revealing a small, makeshift shelter built from scavenged metal and natural materials. The structure was sturdy, with walls reinforced by pieces of debris from his ship and large, flat stones serving as a roof. This is it, Jack said, stepping inside and motioning for Kira to follow. It's not much, but it's home for now. Kira hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was small but functional, with a sleeping area made from soft leaves and a fire pit in the center for warmth. A few scavenged tools and supplies were scattered around, and there was a large water container in the corner, filled with what looked like rainwater. Kira let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a safe place to rest, and that was more than she had expected to find. "You've done a good job with this," she said, glancing around. "It's impressive, considering the circumstances." Jack shrugged modestly, leaning against one of the support beams. "It's kept me alive so far. That's what matters." Kira sat down near the fire pit, her muscles aching from the long journey. The exhaustion was starting to catch up with her, and she could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when there was still so much uncertainty. "Do you think we can find my crew?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack's expression softened, and he sat down across from her. "We'll try, but the terrain out here is brutal, and if they've wandered off too far, well, it won't be easy. But we won't give up." Kira nodded, grateful for his honesty, even if the answer wasn't what she wanted to hear. She stared into the fire pit, the flickering flames providing some measure of comfort in the otherwise hostile world they found themselves in. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the crackle of the fire and the distant calls of the alien wildlife. It was a strange kind of peace, fragile, but real. And despite everything, Kira found herself feeling a little safer knowing that Jack was there. After a long pause, Jack spoke again. "We'll head out in the morning. I know a few areas we haven't searched yet. There's a chance we'll find something. If your crew's out there, we'll bring them back." "Thank you," Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Jack met her gaze, his green eyes steady and reassuring. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out." For the first time since the crash, Kira felt a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. As she lay down to rest, the firelight casting shadows on the walls of the shelter, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but at least she wouldn't face them alone. Morning came quickly, and the humid air of the alien jungle was thick with the scents of earth and strange plants as Kira and Jack prepared to set out. Kira had slept better than she had since the crash, though the sleep was still fitful with dreams of her crewmates lost in the jungle or worse, their fates uncertain. But now, with the sun casting long shadows across the shelter and the sound of unfamiliar birds echoing in the distance, the time had come to continue the search. Jack handed Kira a ration pack he had salvaged from his ship. "Eat up. We'll need the energy. The area we're headed to is rough terrain, and we'll be out there all day." Kira nodded, taking the pack gratefully. She was still sore from the crash and their long trek the day before, but determination drove her forward. There was a chance her crew was still out there, alive, waiting for rescue. She couldn't let them down. As they set out, the jungle around them seemed alive with movement. Giant trees loomed overhead, their leaves glowing faintly with bioluminescence, casting a greenish-blue hue across the forest floor. Every step felt precarious, as if at any moment something could emerge from the thick undergrowth. The sounds of alien creatures called out from the distance, some shrill, others low and guttural. "So, what's the plan?" Kira asked as they carefully navigated the uneven ground, keeping their pace steady. "There's a plateau a few miles north of here," Jack explained, his eyes scanning the horizon for landmarks. "I've seen some debris in the area from my own explorations, and it's possible some of your crew ended up there. If they survived, it would be one of the best places to find shelter." Kira's heart leapt at the possibility. "You think they could have made it?" Jack glanced at her, his expression serious but hopeful. "If they had the same training as you, there's a chance. This planet is brutal, but it's not impossible to survive if you know what you're doing. We just need to find them before the wildlife does." Kira swallowed hard at the thought. They had seen little of the creatures that lived in the jungle, but the distant roars and the occasional movement through the trees hinted at the size and danger of the planet's predators. The thought of her crewmates wandering out there, injured or vulnerable, made her stomach churn. They pressed on, the hours slipping by as they made their way deeper into the jungle. The ground became rockier as they approached the plateau, and the thick foliage thinned, giving way to craggy cliffs and steep inclines. The climb was difficult, but Kira was grateful for the physical challenge. It kept her mind focused on the task at hand, distracting her from the fear that gnawed at her. As they reached the base of the plateau,
Jack signaled for Kira to stop,
holding up his hand. "Wait." Kira froze, her heart pounding as she followed Jack's gaze. There, nestled in a rocky outcropping, was a faint trail of smoke rising into the air. "Someone's out there," Kira whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. "Could be one of your crew, or it could be something else." The weight of his words hung in the air. There was no telling who or what they might find up ahead. But Kira couldn't turn back now. Her mind raced with the possibilities. If it was her crew, they might be hurt, needing help. And if it wasn't, "I have to know," Kira said, her voice firm. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but he nodded. "Stay close. We'll check it out." With careful steps, they made their way toward the source of the smoke, keeping to the shadows and moving as quietly as possible. The rocky terrain offered some cover, but Kira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edges of their vision. As they climbed higher, the sound of voices reached their ears, faint at first, but growing louder as they neared the source of the smoke. Kira's heart raced. Voices meant survivors, but whether they were friend or foe was still unclear. Jack crouched behind a large boulder, motioning for Kira to do the same. "Wait here," he whispered. "I'll take a look." Kira watched as Jack moved stealthily ahead, his movements practiced and fluid. She crouched lower, her pulse quickening as she waited, every second feeling like an eternity. She strained to hear the voices, trying to make out what they were saying, but the wind carried only faint murmurs. After what felt like forever, Jack returned, his expression tense. "It's them," he said, his voice low. "Two of your crew. They're hurt but alive. It looks like they've been here for a while." Relief flooded through Kira, and she stood up quickly, ready to run to them. But Jack held out a hand, stopping her. "Wait," he cautioned. "There's something else. I saw tracks near their camp, large, heavy tracks. They're not alone out here." Kira's breath caught in her throat. "What kind of tracks?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure, but they were fresh. Something big has been circling their camp, probably watching them. If we're going to help them, we need to be smart about this." Fear coursed through Kira, but she forced herself to stay calm. Her crewmates were alive, that was all that mattered. They could figure out the rest later. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We can't leave them out there." Jack nodded, his eyes sharp. "Stay close to me. We'll move quickly, but quietly. If that thing is still out there, we don't want to draw attention to ourselves." Together, they crept toward the small camp where the two survivors were huddled around a makeshift fire. Kira's heart ached when she saw them, bruised, dirty, and exhausted, but alive. The relief was overwhelming, but there was no time for celebration. Jack was right, they were not alone. As they approached, one of the crewmates, a woman named Erin, spotted them. Her eyes widened in shock, and she struggled to her feet, her voice shaky. "Kira? You're alive?" Kira rushed forward, her heart swelling with emotion. "Erin, I thought I'd lost you." The two women embraced briefly before Erin pulled back, her eyes filled with fear. "It's been following us," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the edge of the camp. "We've seen it at night. It's big, too big. We've been hiding, but it knows we're here." Kira's blood ran cold. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We'll get you back to safety, but we need to move quickly. Whatever's been stalking you, it's close." The other survivor, a man named Jace, struggled to his feet, wincing in pain. His leg was bandaged poorly, and it was clear he couldn't move fast. "Can you walk?" Jack asked, his gaze assessing Jace's condition. "I'll manage," Jace grunted, though it was clear he was in pain. Kira glanced nervously at the tree line, every rustle of leaves sending a spike of fear through her. The jungle felt alive with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. "We need to go," she urged, helping Jace to his feet. But as they prepared to leave, a low growl echoed from the darkness of the jungle. The sound was deep and menacing, sending a chill down Kira's spine. Jack's eyes hardened, his hand moving to the weapon strapped to his side. "It's here." The group froze, fear gripping them as the growl grew louder, closer. The jungle around them seemed to shift, the shadows deepening as something massive moved through the trees. Kira's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She glanced at Jack, who was already in a defensive stance, his eyes locked on the darkness ahead. "We have to move," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now." Without another word, they bolted, adrenaline fueling their every step as they raced back toward the shelter. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed through the jungle behind them, the creature in pursuit. Kira's lungs burned, but she pushed herself harder, not daring to look back. Whatever was following them was fast, too fast. They wouldn't make it to the shelter in time. Just when Kira thought all hope was lost, Jack turned, firing his weapon into the trees. The blast lit up the jungle, and for a brief moment, Kira caught a glimpse of the creature, massive, with thick, leathery skin and glowing yellow eyes. But the shot only slowed it down. "Keep moving," Jack shouted, grabbing Kira's arm and pulling her forward. The jungle blurred around them as they ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. The shelter was close if they could just make it inside. With one final burst of speed, they reached the clearing, crashing through the entrance of the shelter and slamming the door behind them. For a moment, all was silent. The only sound was their ragged breathing as they collapsed against the walls, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. "We made it," Erin whispered, her voice shaking. "We're alive." But Kira knew this was only the beginning. The creature was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it had them. "We need a plan," Jack said, his voice grim. "Because next time, we might not be so lucky." The silence inside the shelter was almost unbearable. The heavy breathing of Kira, Jack, Erin, and Jace was the only sound that filled the small, makeshift space. The low growl they had heard outside was still fresh in their minds, and Kira could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. They had made it out of the jungle alive for now, but the threat outside was far from gone. Jack stood at the small window, peering cautiously into the jungle. His face was set in a grim line, his jaw tight. Kira knew what he was thinking. The creature that had chased them wasn't just any wild animal. It was a predator, intelligent, patient, and far too close for comfort.